Hello, everybody. Today we're going to have another one of my original stories, something a little dark and strange. This is called Wrecker's Point. Side note, I cannot do accents, so please use your imagination. Wrecker's Point by me, Katie. Winter had been long this year, and the storms that had grown in the early spring destroyed the stone groins, smashed boats against the harbour walls, and brought the cliff edges down along the length of the island. Wrecker's Point sat in the North Atlantic, on the cusp of the Arctic, characterized by sheer granite cliffs, rocks jutting out of the water, small spiky grasses, and stunted crab apples. It was notable only for the trench, last measured at 10,000 meters deep. It was not accurately charted on any map, seeming to move and change position, snaking through the water and circling the island. On nights when it was even too cold for the aurora borealis, the trench gave off a glow of bioluminescence. It was often found clinging to debris that washed up on the small beaches of the island, a vibrant, deep indigo. It was thicker than water, and when scraped off, it had the consistency of mud. The islanders sometimes bottled it up and left it on the doorstep overnight, as a ward of sorts, but it was considered bad luck to bring it indoors. It sat on the harbour wall, marking where the water had been at the high tide, and you'd find it on boats while scraping off barnacles or mending the hull. A fisherman who found it there would not go to sea until it stopped glowing. It was also found on Liam Beaumont's remains, a small arm, pale and pink, discovered in some seaweed-covered driftwood by Hamish Donegal out walking his sheepdog. The howling wind of the spring storms, which had abated somewhat, were replaced by the wailing of Wilma Beaumont, and her cries shook the foundations of cottages right at the heart of the island. Then she went quiet, and had not left her home for weeks, and by all accounts she had not left her bed, becoming somewhat comatose. Caught in the net of her grief, Daniel Beaumont, father and husband, spent whole days standing on the harbour wall, with the wreckages of the storm-smashed boats around him, and a promise to fish the waters around the island until he found the rest of his son. He would proclaim this mission to gritted teeth or tearful sobs, depending on whether you met him in the street or at Hamish's pub. His hair, usually neat and combed back, stood on end, his chin darkened with spiky stubble, and black circles appeared beneath his eyes, which had taken on a frenzied kind of flicker. But Daniel was no sailor. He was no islander. Born far inland on the chalk hills of England, where water was little more than a gentle stream or lazy river, he had met, married, and followed Wilma to Wrecker's Point, where she hoped to join a scientific research team investigating the trench. For a while he had been held at arm's length by the island natives, except for old Hamish, who was as friendly and kind a bloke as there could ever be. He had hosted Liam's wake, no charge. It was through him that Daniel was allowed to integrate somewhat, first with the regulars, then in a natural kind of ripple. He had met Angus Reid when their wives were both pregnant, and they often ran into each other in the waiting rooms of doctors and midwives. Angus was not a fisherman. He had promised his mum he would not go to sea and be lost like his own dad. He worked instead at the warehouse, on the docks, and the abattoir. Through him, Daniel learned some of the superstitions surrounding the trench. The first fish caught in the season was given to the trench. You did not fish above it. You did not stare too long at the glow, especially at spring tide. Though these whispers and half-known legends were nothing to be taken seriously in Daniel's case, it was not as if the trench cared what the islanders thought of it. For 10 years things had been good. The research team never materialized, though Wilma found her calling at a wildlife rescue, and Daniel was able to work remotely, editing academic papers. Together with Wilma, Daniel had built himself a life, with Liam at the center, and now it was all gone. washed away by an unforgiving sea. And so it was overcast when Daniel Beaumont, Angus Reed, and Duff set out early that autumn morning on Duff's weather-beaten old boat, the Nucklevee. The rest of the inhabitants of Wreckers Point turned out to see them go, standing silent at the harbour as the gulls and kittiwakes circled, crying up above, and a single jackdaw pecked at a piece of discarded fishing line. Angus Reed's old mother had pressed her pendant, containing the image of St. Andrew, into his hand as he jumped aboard. His own wife had refused to come, and she kept their son with her. Wilmer was also not there. Duff still had last night's beer in his white beard as they pulled out into the open sea. The men had spoken little as they set up the rods, 3 on each side. Duff gave the orders and then disappeared into the little wooden cabin. He was a gruff old fellow, age unknown, a great white beard and lined, leathery face, a fisherman, born from generations of fishermen. He was the one who had finally agreed to take Daniel out, though what use there was to the mission no one rightly knew. They all knew that all that would be found of little Liam Beaumont had already been found. There had been talk and speculation. Just how exactly the kid had ended up in the water in the first place. He had disappeared on one of the rare calm days of that season. One minute he had been walking the high street with Angus Reed's son, stopping in at the sweet shop, and then to the small park where the other kids had been, and the next, evening had fallen, and every other child had returned home, but Liam was nowhere to be found. "Beaumont," Angus said as noon was approaching. "There's nothing here, mate. We should turn back." Daniel was sitting at the stern, watching the still rods fervently as the boat drifted in the current. "I want to bury all of my son, Angus," he said. "If not him, then I'll find whatever fish it was and bury that instead." "There's no fish in these waters. Big," began Angus. But Daniel cut him off. "Something out there," he gestured vaguely towards the sea. "Something out there got him. He shouldn't have been in the water, but he was a good swimmer. Everyone knows the waters out here can't be trusted," replied Angus. "The weather neither. You can't capture the wind or bury the rain." "Just blew off the island, did he?" Daniel replied. "Just washed down into the sea like... But Daniel couldn't find the words. Anger flared in him. The whole island hated him. His friend was not his friend. He had lied to him all these years. He was an outsider, and now his child was dead, and his wife a ghost, an empty shell. If he put his ear to her chest, as he often did when he laid down with her, he could hear the sea. Waves crashed and rolled in his head, and he shouted, "Why did you come then?" Angus replied, "I am not letting a drunk like Duff take you off only for your bits to wind up in the rack and wraith." Angus had spread his arms to indicate the sea and continued, "Why do you think no one else would take you, eh?" He strode off to check the lines, brow furrowed. Daniel got to his feet, walked into the cabin where Duff was resting on a wooden chair, fished around inside the single little cupboard, and brought out a fillet knife. Duff peered out from under the brim of his cap. "Catch something to take home, laddie?" "No," Daniel replied, the knife in his fist, a furious resolution in his heart. Angus was bent over one of the rods, adjusting its position. He turned when he heard Daniel approach. "I'm sorry, all right," he said, getting to his feet. "I've lost a few mates out here before, that's all. Let's just agree to go back before dark." "How about we agree to get back once I've caught the fish that ate my son," Daniel said. Shifting in his hand, the knife took on a dead, leaden grey of the sky. Angus backed up against the side of the boat, eyes wide. "Put that away, lad," Dove said, appearing from the cabin. Daniel half turned to look at him, and Angus shoved him to the ground. The 2 men wrestled on the deck of the Nucklevee, stopping short of punching one another. Duff watched and said nothing. At last, Angus wrenched the small knife from Daniel's hand. "Better lock that cupboard," Angus panted, handing the knife to Duff, who agreed with a soft "aye." Daniel lay, dazed. In the ensuing silence, the wind began to rise and whistle eerily through the rod guides. There had been opposition to the research team. Duff had led the small but very vocal group of locals. When there were tentative beginnings of a headquarters being set up in an unused church, the equipment had been vandalized. Expensive equipment that the small team did not have the funds to replace. Windows had not been smashed, but the bioluminescence of the trench had been painted across every stained glass window face. Across the holy face of Mary, the apostles, and Jesus himself. The research team had left. Wilma and Daniel stayed. They had not spoken about it much. Daniel thought it was ludicrous. Most of the inhabitants of Wrecker's Point had adopted an air of dismissiveness that thinly masked a deep discomfort. The rest had righteous pride in their step and remarked that the trench had been appeased. On the night Liam never came home, Daniel had rung Angus first. Were the boys there? When did Angus Jr. come home? Was he certain the boys were not together? While their wives and Angus Jr. sat up and waited, Daniel and Angus had run frantic through Wrecker's Point, checking with Hamish, checking with the daughter of Molly Grimald, and soon the whole town had been up with them, combing the island, and all the while the sea glowed around them. Daniel had encountered Duff while he and some of the other fishermen checked all the vessels in the docks. They had been shouting Liam's name, calling for him as they checked cabins and under the tarps of skiffs. Duff had been standing on his boat, silent, still, and staring out beyond the harbour toward the sea. When Daniel hailed him, he had turned and said, "Your babby ain't here, lad." It had taken a week for what was left of Liam to wash up on shore.